The grand halls of Whitmore Music Conservatory echoed with the sound of a piano that seemed to sing with perfection. Behind those keys sat David, a 28-year-old man whose fingers moved like lightning across the black and white keys. Students would gather outside the practice rooms just to hear him play, whispering to each other about how incredible he was. David had been the star student at this famous music school for 3 whole years. Teachers praised him constantly, and other students looked at him with a mix of admiration and jealousy. He could play the most difficult pieces without breaking a sweat, and his performances left audiences speechless. When David played, it was like watching magic happen right before your eyes. But success had changed David in ways that weren't so beautiful. He had started to believe that he was better than everyone else around him. During group classes, he would roll his eyes when other students made mistakes. He would whisper mean comments about how some people just don't have what it takes to be real musicians. His attitude had become as sharp as his playing was smooth. The teachers at the conservatory knew about David's growing ego problem, but they chose to ignore it. Why? Because David brought fame and money to their school. When newspapers wrote about the conservatory, they always mentioned David's name. When rich people decided to donate money to the school, it was often because they had heard David perform. So the teachers looked the other way when David acted rudely to his classmates. David's daily routine had become a show of his superiority. He would arrive at school in expensive clothes, carrying his leather music bag like it was a crown. He would walk past other students without acknowledging them, unless it was to make a sarcastic comment about their playing. During lunch breaks, he would sit at the best table in the cafeteria, surrounded by students who wanted to be in his good graces. The practice rooms were David's kingdom. He had claimed the largest room with the best piano, and everyone knew not to disturb him when he was practicing. Through the soundproof glass, students could see him playing with intense concentration, his face showing both passion and pride. He practiced for hours every day, not just to improve, but to maintain his position as the undisputed best student in the school. David's teachers had tried to talk to him about his attitude, but their words fell on deaf ears. "Talent like yours comes with responsibility," Professor Williams had told him once. But David just smiled and nodded, thinking to himself that his responsibility was to show others how real music should be played. He believed that being kind to weaker students would somehow make him less special. In the evenings, when most students had gone home, David would often stay behind to practice on the school's most precious instrument, a beautiful black grand piano that cost more than most people's houses. He treated this piano like his personal property, and in a way it had become exactly that. No one else dared to touch those keys when David was around. The other students had mixed feelings about David. Some genuinely admired his skill and hoped to learn from him. Others were afraid of him and tried to stay out of his way. A few brave ones had tried to become his friends, but David only seemed interested in people who could benefit his career somehow. He saw other students not as friends or colleagues, but as competition that needed to be kept at a distance. David's reputation had spread far beyond the conservatory walls. Local newspapers often featured articles about the young piano genius who was destined for greatness. Concert halls were already booking him for performances, and music agents were calling his phone regularly. All this attention only made David's ego grow bigger and bigger, like a balloon that was about to burst. What David didn't realize was that his attitude was creating enemies among his fellow students. They were getting tired of his constant put-downs and superior behavior. Some had started to hope that someone, someday, would humble this arrogant young man. They wanted to see David learn that talent without kindness is like a beautiful flower without fragrance. Impressive to look at, but missing something essential. As David prepared for what he thought would be another ordinary evening at the conservatory, he had no idea that his world was about to be turned completely upside down. The lessons he was about to learn would change not just his music, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be truly talented. 3 weeks before this story truly begins, a new face appeared in the evening classes at Whitmore Music Conservatory. Her name was Rosa, and she was 35 years old, much older than the typical students who filled these halls. While most students arrived in cars or took taxis, Rosa came by bus, always carrying a worn backpack and wearing simple clothes that had clearly seen many years of use. Rosa worked the night shift at Metropolitan General Hospital, cleaning floors and emptying trash cans from midnight until 8 in the morning. After finishing her work, instead of going home to sleep like most people would, she would take 2 buses across the city to attend piano lessons at the conservatory. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning supplies and hard work, seemed out of place in the elegant practice rooms filled with students who had never known such struggles. She always sat in the back corner of every classroom, never raising her hand to ask questions, never volunteering to play for the class. When teachers called on her directly, Rosa would answer in a soft voice that barely carried to the front of the room. Her classmates rarely paid attention to her, assuming she was just another adult trying to fulfill a childhood dream that had been delayed by life's responsibilities. Rosa's daily schedule would exhaust most people. After her hospital shift ended at 8 in the morning, she would grab a quick breakfast from a vending machine and head straight to the conservatory. She attended classes until noon, then went home to her small apartment to sleep for just 4 hours before getting up to eat dinner and prepare for another night of work. This routine left her constantly tired, but she never missed a single class. The other students noticed Rosa's dedication, but they misunderstood what it meant. They thought she was just an enthusiastic beginner who didn't realize how much natural talent was required to succeed in music. Some felt sorry for her, watching her struggle to afford the monthly tuition payments. Others barely acknowledged her existence, too focused on their own musical ambitions to pay attention to the quiet woman in the back of the room. During group practice sessions, Rosa would always volunteer to go last, if at all. When she did play, she chose simple pieces that didn't showcase any particular skill. Her performances were technically correct, but seemed to lack the fire and passion that the teachers were always encouraging students to develop. The professors would give her polite feedback and move on quickly to students they considered more promising. Rosa lived in a tiny studio apartment across town, in a neighborhood where most of the conservatory students would never venture. Her furniture was secondhand, and her most valuable possession was an old digital keyboard she had bought from a pawn shop. Every morning after classes, she would practice on this small keyboard with headphones on, so she wouldn't disturb her neighbors who were trying to sleep during the day. The walls of Rosa's apartment were bare except for one item, a faded photograph of a young girl sitting at a grand piano, smiling brightly while holding a trophy. Most people who saw this picture assumed it was Rosa's daughter, or perhaps a niece she was proud of. The truth behind that photograph was something Rosa had never shared with anyone at the conservatory, and she had good reasons for keeping that secret buried deep in her past. Rosa's co-workers at the hospital knew her as a reliable, hardworking woman who never complained about the difficult hours or demanding work. They had no idea that their quiet colleague spent her days learning music at one of the city's most prestigious institutions. To them, Rosa was simply someone who showed up on time, did her job well, and went home without causing any drama. At the conservatory, Rosa's teachers saw potential in her dedication, but they worried about her age and background. They had seen many adult students come and go over the years, most of them eventually giving up when they realized how much work was required to develop real musical skill. They tried to be encouraging, but privately, they doubted whether Rosa would stick with her studies long enough to achieve anything significant. What none of them knew was that Rosa had a secret that would soon shock everyone at the conservatory. Hidden beneath her humble exterior and quiet demeanor was a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about talent, opportunity, and the true meaning of musical gift. Rosa carried with her a past that she had carefully concealed, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about who she really was. The other students often wondered why Rosa seemed so interested in watching the advanced students practice. They assumed she was trying to learn by observing their techniques, not realizing that Rosa was actually studying something completely different. She was watching how these privileged students treated their gifts, how they interacted with each other, and how they used their talents to build themselves up or tear others down. Rosa had learned patience through years of hard work and sacrifice. She had learned humility through circumstances that had forced her to start over from nothing. And most importantly, she had learned that true talent is not just about technical skill, but about the character of the person who possesses that skill. Soon, she would have the chance to demonstrate all of these lessons in a way that would change everything. The evening of October 15th started like any other event at Whitmore Music Conservatory. The grand reception hall was filled with students, teachers, and wealthy donors who had come to celebrate another successful student recital. Crystal glasses clinked with expensive wine, and well-dressed people moved in small groups discussing the performances they had just witnessed. The atmosphere was sophisticated and elegant, exactly the kind of environment where David felt most comfortable. David stood near the conservatory's most prized possession, a magnificent black Steinway grand piano that dominated the center of the reception hall. This instrument was worth more than most people's homes, and it was only brought out for special occasions. David had positioned himself next to it deliberately, knowing that people would naturally gather around both him and the beautiful piano. A small crowd had formed around David as he shared stories about his upcoming performance at Carnegie Hall. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never known failure, gesturing dramatically with his wine glass as he described the pieces he would be performing. The people listening hung on his every word, impressed by his talent and his apparent connections in the classical music world. "You know," David said, his voice carrying across the nearby conversations, "real musicians have a certain quality that you can spot immediately. It's in the way they carry themselves, the way they dress, the way they understand the music on a deeper level." His audience nodded appreciatively, though some seemed a bit uncomfortable with his tone of superiority. That's when David noticed Rosa standing about 10 feet away, quietly admiring the Steinway piano. She had changed out of her usual simple clothes into a modest black dress for the reception, but even in her best outfit, she looked out of place among the designer gowns and expensive suits surrounding her. David's eyes focused on her work-worn hands as she gently reached toward the piano, stopping just short of touching the polished surface. "Take that woman over there, for example," David said, speaking loudly enough for Rosa to hear while pretending she couldn't. "You can tell just by looking at her that she's not a serious musician. Real pianists have soft hands from years of proper training, not hands that look like they've been doing manual labor." His audience shifted uncomfortably, but David was too caught up in his own performance to notice their discomfort. Rosa heard every word, but she didn't turn around or respond. She simply continued looking at the piano with the same quiet appreciation she had shown since arriving at the conservatory. Her silence seemed to annoy David, who was used to getting reactions from people when he made such comments. "I bet she's one of those adult students who thinks they can become concert pianists by taking a few evening classes," David continued, his voice getting louder and more cruel. "It's almost sad, really. Some people just don't understand that musical talent is something you're born with, not something you can learn from a textbook." Professor Williams, the elderly dean of the conservatory, was standing nearby and tried to change the subject. "David, why don't you tell us about the new piece you've been working on?" he suggested, hoping to redirect the conversation away from Rosa. But David was enjoying his audience too much to let the moment pass. "Actually, I have a better idea," David announced, his eyes gleaming with what he thought was cleverness. "Why don't we have a little demonstration? I'll play something and then our friend here can try to follow along. It might be educational for everyone to see the difference between real talent and, well, wishful thinking." The room fell silent. Even David's most loyal admirers looked shocked at the cruelty of his suggestion. Rosa finally turned around to face him, her expression calm and dignified despite the obvious insult. For a moment, David thought she might walk away or start crying, which would have satisfied his need to prove his point. Instead, Rosa surprised everyone by speaking in her quiet but clear voice. "I accept your challenge," she said simply. "What would you like to play?" Her response caught David completely off guard. He had expected her to decline or make excuses, not agree to what he saw as certain humiliation. David recovered quickly, his confidence returning as he realized this would be even better than he had hoped. "I'll play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, he announced proudly. "It's one of the most technically demanding pieces in classical music. I'm sure you've heard of it even if you've never attempted to play it." Rosa nodded calmly. "I'm familiar with the piece," she said. "Would you like to begin?" The crowd that had gathered around David and the piano had grown larger, as other reception guests noticed the unusual confrontation taking place. Some people looked excited to witness David's superior skills on display, while others seemed uncomfortable with the obvious mismatch. A few whispered among themselves, questioning whether this was appropriate behavior at such an elegant event. David couldn't have been more pleased with how the evening was developing. He saw this as the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his superiority in front of an audience that included some very important people in the classical music world. He had no doubt that Rosa would embarrass herself trying to play such a difficult piece, and her failure would only make his own skills look more impressive by comparison. As David prepared to sit down at the piano bench, he had no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The quiet woman he was about to humiliate carried secrets that would soon turn his world completely upside down. In just a few minutes, David would learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who appear to be the weakest. David walked toward the piano bench with the swagger of someone who had never lost a musical competition in his life. The crowd around him had grown to include nearly half the people at the reception, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something memorable, though they had no idea just how memorable it would turn out to be. "Ladies and gentlemen," David announced as he adjusted the piano bench to his preferred height, "I'm going to perform the opening movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. For those of you who aren't familiar with classical music, this piece is considered one of the most technically challenging works ever written for piano. It requires years of advanced training and natural talent to perform properly." He paused dramatically, looking directly at Rosa with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "After I finish, our friend here will attempt the same piece. I think this will be very educational for everyone present." The way he said educational made it clear that he expected Rosa's performance to serve as an example of what happens when amateurs try to play professional level music. Rosa stood quietly beside the piano, her hands folded in front of her, showing no sign of nervousness or fear. Her calm demeanor actually irritated David, who had expected her to look anxious or try to back out of the challenge. He interpreted her silence as stubbornness rather than confidence, which only made him more determined to prove his point in the most dramatic way possible. "I should mention," David continued, addressing the crowd like a professor giving a lecture, "that this particular concerto has been the downfall of many professional pianists. The technical demands are so extreme that even conservatory graduates often avoid attempting it until they have several years of concert experience. It requires not just finger dexterity, but also incredible mental stamina and emotional depth." Professor Williams shifted uncomfortably in the crowd, recognizing the cruelty in David's approach. He had seen talented students become arrogant before, but David was taking his superiority complex to a new level. The elderly professor considered intervening, but he was curious to see how this unusual situation would play out. Something about Rosa's quiet confidence intrigued him, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. David finally sat down at the piano bench and adjusted his position with the practiced movements of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. He stretched his fingers briefly, cracking his knuckles in a way that made several people in the audience wince. "This piece tells a story," he explained, still addressing the crowd rather than focusing on the music. "It's a story of struggle, triumph, and ultimately, the victory of talent over adversity." The irony of his words was lost on David, but it wasn't lost on Rosa, who continued to stand patiently beside the piano. She had heard this concerto performed many times, and she knew that David's interpretation of its meaning was both shallow and self-serving. The piece was indeed about struggle and triumph, but not in the way David understood it. "Now," David said, placing his hands above the keys, "let me show you how this music is supposed to sound when it's played by someone who truly understands its complexity." He looked around the room one more time, making sure he had everyone's attention before beginning to play. The opening notes of the Rachmaninoff concerto filled the reception hall with their haunting melody. David's technical skill was immediately apparent. His fingers moved with precision and speed, hitting every note exactly as written. The crowd watched in respectful silence, impressed by his obvious ability to handle such a difficult piece. This was exactly the kind of performance that had made David famous throughout the conservatory. But as David played, something was missing from his performance. While his technique was flawless, the music felt cold and mechanical. He was playing the notes perfectly, but he wasn't telling the story that Rachmaninoff had intended. The emotional depth that should have accompanied such a passionate piece was nowhere to be found. David was showing off his skills rather than serving the music. Rosa listened with the trained ear of someone who understood both the technical and emotional requirements of the piece. She could hear David's talent, but she could also hear his limitations. He was playing the music as if it were a mathematical equation to be solved, rather than an emotional journey to be experienced. His performance was impressive but soulless. As David reached the climactic sections of the movement, his playing became even more aggressive and showy. He attacked the keys with unnecessary force, making the piano sound harsh rather than powerful. Several people in the audience began to look uncomfortable, sensing that something was wrong with the performance even if they couldn't identify exactly what it was. When David finally finished, he lifted his hands from the keys with a flourish and stood up to accept the polite applause that followed. The audience clapped because they recognized his technical skill, but the applause was restrained and brief. Something about the performance had left them feeling unsatisfied, though most couldn't explain why. "And that," David announced with obvious satisfaction, "is how Rachmaninoff intended this piece to be played. Now let's see what our amateur friend can do with it." He gestured toward Rosa with exaggerated politeness, stepping aside to give her access to the piano bench. His expression made it clear that he expected the next few minutes to provide entertainment at Rosa's expense. Rosa approached the piano with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the evening. As she adjusted the bench to her height, David couldn't help but notice that her movements seemed surprisingly familiar with the instrument. For just a moment, a tiny doubt crept into his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. After all, even beginners knew how to adjust a piano bench. David's fingers descended onto the keys like a machine programmed for perfection. From the very first note, it was clear that he possessed remarkable technical ability. His hands moved across the keyboard with lightning speed, executing the complex passages of Rachmaninoff's concerto with the kind of precision that takes years to develop. Every scale was perfectly even, every chord struck with mathematical accuracy. The audience watched in amazement as David's fingers flew through sections that would challenge even professional pianists. His left hand maintained the powerful bass lines while his right hand danced through intricate melodies that seemed to sparkle in the air above the piano. Not a single note was missed. Not a single rhythm was imprecise. It was a display of pure technical mastery that left no doubt about David's abilities as a pianist. David had clearly spent countless hours perfecting every detail of this piece. His fingering was flawless, his timing was exact, and his memory was complete. He navigated the most difficult passages without hesitation, his confidence growing with each successfully executed section. This was the kind of performance that had earned him his reputation as the conservatory's most talented student. As he played, David's face showed intense concentration, mixed with obvious satisfaction. He knew he was impressing the audience, and he could feel their attention focused entirely on his performance. This was his element, the spotlight, the admiration, the undeniable proof of his superiority. Every note he played was another nail in the coffin of anyone who might dare to challenge his position as the school's premier talent. The Rachmaninoff Concerto is known for its emotional peaks and valleys, its moments of tender beauty followed by passages of thunderous power. David handled all of these contrasts with technical competence, making the soft sections appropriately quiet and the loud sections impressively forceful. His dynamic control was excellent, showing that he understood the basic structure of the piece. But something was missing from David's performance, something that the more experienced listeners in the audience began to notice as the piece progressed. While his playing was technically perfect, it felt strangely empty. The notes were all correct, but they didn't seem to connect with each other in a meaningful way. It was like watching a beautiful painting that had been created by copying every brushstroke from the original, without understanding why the artist had made those particular choices. David played the passionate sections with aggression rather than emotion, hitting the keys harder than necessary to create volume. The tender moments came across as mere quiet interludes rather than expressions of deep feeling. He was performing the mechanics of the music without accessing its soul, like an actor reciting lines without understanding the character's motivations. Professor Williams, standing in the crowd, recognized what was happening. He had heard this same problem in David's playing for months, but it had become more pronounced as the young man's ego had grown. David was so focused on showing off his technical skills that he had forgotten that music is supposed to communicate something beyond mere notes. He was playing at the music rather than playing the music itself. The audience remained impressed by David's obvious skill, but they also felt a strange sense of dissatisfaction as the performance continued. Something about the music felt cold and calculated, like listening to a computer generate sounds rather than a human being sharing emotions. The technical brilliance was undeniable, but the heart of the music seemed to be missing. As David reached the climactic sections of the concerto, his playing became even more aggressive and showy. He threw his entire body into the performance, swaying dramatically and attacking the keys with unnecessary force. The piano responded with harsh, brittle sounds that were impressive in their volume but unpleasant to listen to for extended periods. David was so caught up in his own performance that he failed to notice the subtle reactions of his audience. While they continued to watch respectfully, many people had unconsciously taken small steps backward, as if the harshness of his playing was physically pushing them away. Others had slight frowns on their faces, sensing that something was wrong even if they couldn't identify exactly what it was. When David finally brought the piece to its thunderous conclusion, he lifted his hands from the keys with a dramatic flourish that was clearly calculated for maximum visual impact. He stood up immediately and turned toward the audience with a triumphant smile, expecting to bask in their amazement and applause. The applause that followed was polite but restrained. People clapped because they recognized David's technical achievement, but the enthusiasm that usually follows a truly great performance was notably absent. The sound was more like the kind of applause given to a skilled athlete after a good play rather than the kind given to an artist after a moving performance. David interpreted the applause as validation of his superiority, completely missing the subtle signs that his performance had left the audience feeling somewhat cold and unsatisfied. He bowed deeply, soaking up what he believed was admiration for his incredible talent. In his mind, he had just delivered a knockout punch that would make Rosa's inevitable failure even more embarrassing by comparison. And that, David announced to the crowd, his voice filled with obvious pride, is how you play Rachmaninoff when you have the proper training and natural ability. He gestured toward the piano bench with mock courtesy. Now let's see what happens when someone without those advantages attempts the same piece. As David stepped aside to make room for Rosa, he was absolutely convinced that the next few minutes would provide the perfect contrast to his own brilliant performance. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would shatter every assumption he had made about talent, training, and the true meaning of musical greatness. Rosa approached the piano with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the evening, but something had changed in her demeanor. As she settled onto the bench, her posture shifted slightly, becoming more upright and confident. Her work-worn hands moved to the keys with a familiarity that seemed to surprise even her, as if they were remembering something that had been dormant for too long. The audience watched with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, expecting to witness an awkward attempt by an amateur to play a piece far beyond her abilities. Many people felt uncomfortable about what was about to happen, sensing the cruelty in David's challenge, but they couldn't look away. David himself stood beside the piano with a satisfied smirk, already imagining how Rosa's failure would further cement his reputation as the conservatory's undisputed star. Rosa placed her fingers on the keys and paused for just a moment, closing her eyes briefly as if she were listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them again, there was a subtle but noticeable change in her expression. The timid, apologetic look that had characterized her appearance throughout her time at the conservatory was gone, replaced by something deeper and more focused. Then Rosa began to play, and from the very first note, everything changed. The opening melody of the Rachmaninoff concerto flowed from the piano like water from a mountain spring, natural, effortless, and pure. Where David had attacked the keys with technical precision, Rosa seemed to be having a conversation with them, coaxing sounds from the instrument that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the music itself. The same notes that David had played correctly suddenly became something entirely different. They became alive. The audience felt the difference immediately, even those who knew nothing about classical music. Rosa's playing had a quality that David's had lacked. It had soul. Every note seemed to mean something, to connect with the notes around it in ways that created not just melody but emotion. The music wasn't just being performed. It was being felt and shared with everyone in the room. Professor Williams, standing in the crowd, felt his breath catch in his throat. There was something familiar about Rosa's playing, something that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. He had heard thousands of students play over his long career, but this was different. This wasn't student-level playing. This was something much more sophisticated and mature. As Rosa continued through the opening section of the concerto, her technique became more apparent. Her fingers moved with the same speed and precision that David had displayed, but there was an ease and naturalness to her movements that made difficult passages look effortless. More importantly, every technical choice she made seemed to serve the music rather than show off her abilities. The tender sections of the piece came alive under Rosa's hands in ways that moved several people in the audience to tears. She played these passages with a warmth and understanding that spoke of deep personal experience with loss, hope, and redemption. The music seemed to tell a story about overcoming hardship and finding beauty in unexpected places, themes that resonated powerfully with Rosa's own life journey. David's smirk had completely disappeared from his face. He stood frozen beside the piano, his mouth slightly open, unable to process what he was hearing. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Rosa was supposed to struggle with the basic mechanics of the piece, not transform it into something beautiful and meaningful. His mind raced to find explanations for what he was witnessing, but none of them made sense. When Rosa reached the powerful dramatic sections of the concerto, she handled them with a combination of strength and control that left the audience breathless. But unlike David's aggressive approach, Rosa's powerful playing never became harsh or overwhelming. She understood that true power in music comes not from forcing the instrument to submit, but from working with it to create something greater than either musician or piano could achieve alone. The more experienced musicians in the audience began to recognize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Rosa's interpretation of the piece revealed layers of meaning that many of them had never heard before, even in professional recordings. She wasn't just playing the notes that Rachmaninoff had written. She was channeling the emotions and experiences that had inspired the composer to write them in the first place. Professor Williams suddenly gasped as a memory clicked into place. He grabbed the arm of the person standing next to him, his eyes wide with recognition and disbelief. He remembered where he had heard playing like this before, and the realization sent shockwaves through his understanding of who Rosa really was. Rosa continued playing, seemingly unaware of the stunned reactions of her audience. She was lost in the music, reconnecting with a part of herself that she had been forced to hide for 17 long years. Her fingers found patterns and expressions that she had thought were lost forever. Muscle memory combining with emotional memory to create something truly magical. The transformation in the room was complete. What had started as a cruel entertainment at Rosa's expense had become something sacred and profound. People who had been expecting to witness embarrassment found themselves experiencing one of the most moving musical performances of their lives. Even those who had never cared much for classical music found themselves captivated by the raw emotion and beauty pouring from the piano. David remained frozen in place, his worldview crumbling with every note Rosa played. Everything he had believed about talent, training, and musical superiority was being challenged by this quiet woman who wasn't supposed to be able to play at all. As Rosa approached the climactic finale of the piece, David realized with growing horror that he was about to be completely and utterly humiliated in front of everyone who mattered in his professional world. The revelation was only beginning, and the truth about Rosa's identity would soon shock everyone in the room, even more than her incredible performance already had. As Rosa's performance reached its emotional peak, Professor Williams could no longer contain his shock. The elderly dean of the conservatory pushed through the crowd, his face pale with recognition and disbelief. His sudden movement caught the attention of several people nearby, but their eyes quickly returned to Rosa, who continued to play with devastating beauty and power. "My God," Professor Williams whispered to Dr. Chen, the conservatory's head of piano studies, who was standing beside him. "I know who she is. I know exactly who she is." His voice was shaking with excitement and amazement. Dr. Chen looked at him with confusion, wondering what could have caused such a dramatic reaction in the usually composed professor. Professor Williams had been at the conservatory for over 40 years, and his memory was filled with thousands of students who had passed through these halls. But some performances stay with you forever, and he was now remembering a concert from 18 years ago that had left him speechless. He was remembering a teenage girl whose playing had been so extraordinary that critics had compared her to the greatest pianists in history. "That's Rosa Mendez," Professor Williams said, his voice growing stronger with certainty. "She was a child prodigy who performed with major orchestras across Europe when she was just 16 and 17 years old. I heard her play this exact piece with the London Symphony Orchestra in 2007. She was being called the next great classical pianist of her generation." The news spread through the crowd like wildfire. People began whispering urgently to each other, pulling out their phones to search for information about Rosa Mendez. Those who found articles and old performance videos gasped in amazement as they realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a talented amateur surprising everyone with hidden skills. This was a former world-class performer returning to her true calling. Dr. Chen's eyes widened as the pieces began falling into place. "But what happened to her?" she asked Professor Williams. "She disappeared from the classical music scene completely. There were rumors about a family crisis, but no one knew the details." Professor Williams nodded grimly. "Her mother was in a terrible car accident when Rosa was 18, just as her career was really taking off. Her mother was left partially paralyzed and needed constant care. Rosa gave up everything, her performance contracts, her recording deals, her entire future in music, to take care of her family. She completely disappeared from the classical music world." As this information spread through the crowd, people began to understand the true magnitude of what Rosa had sacrificed. She hadn't just given up a hobby or a part-time interest. She had abandoned what would have certainly become one of the most successful classical music careers of her generation. For 17 years, she had worked ordinary jobs to support her family while keeping her extraordinary gift hidden from the world. The audience watched Rosa's performance with new eyes, understanding now that they weren't just hearing beautiful music. They were witnessing a reunion between a master artist and her calling. Every note she played carried the weight of years of sacrifice, loss, and hidden dreams. The emotion in her playing wasn't just artistic interpretation. It was the sound of someone reclaiming a part of herself that had been dormant for far too long. David stood frozen beside the piano, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and growing horror as he overheard the whispered conversations around him. The woman he had mocked as an amateur was actually a former child prodigy, whose talent far exceeded his own. The manual laborer he had dismissed was someone who had performed on stages he could only dream of reaching. Rosa seemed oblivious to the commotion her identity was causing in the audience. She was completely absorbed in the music, her playing becoming even more powerful and expressive as she approached the concerto's dramatic conclusion. Years of suppressed emotion poured out through her fingers, creating sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere technical skill. Professor Williams found himself crying openly as he listened. He remembered the teenage Rosa, who had captivated audiences across Europe with her mature musicianship and extraordinary emotional depth. Now, seeing her as an adult who had endured so much hardship, her playing had gained layers of meaning and authenticity that were almost too powerful to bear. "She's even better now than she was then," Professor Williams whispered in amazement. "The years of struggle and sacrifice have given her something that pure talent alone could never provide. She's not just playing the music, she's living it." The cruel irony of the situation was not lost on anyone who understood what was happening. David had challenged Rosa to demonstrate the difference between real talent and amateur enthusiasm, not knowing that he was about to be outclassed by someone whose natural gifts and professional experience far exceeded his own. As Rosa built toward the concerto's thunderous finale, the audience held their breath. They knew they were witnessing something historic, not just a beautiful performance, but the moment when a great artist reclaimed her voice after years of silence. The applause that would follow this performance would not be polite recognition of technical skill, but a celebration of courage, sacrifice, and the indestructible power of true musical talent. David's humiliation was now complete, but something even more important was happening. Rosa was discovering that the gift she had thought was lost forever had actually been waiting patiently inside her, growing stronger and deeper through years of life experience. The scared teenager who had abandoned her career to care for her family had become a mature artist whose playing could move people to tears with its authenticity and power. The truth was now fully revealed. and everyone in the room understood that they were no longer watching a simple challenge between two pianists. They were witnessing the resurrection of one of classical music's lost treasures, and the moment when an arrogant young man learned the most important lesson of his life. Rosa brought the Rachmaninoff concerto to its magnificent conclusion, with a power and beauty that seemed to shake the very foundations of the reception hall. As the last notes faded into silence, the room remained frozen for several heartbeats, as if everyone needed time to process what they had just experienced. Then, like a dam bursting, the audience erupted into the most thunderous applause any of them had ever given. People were crying openly, their emotions overwhelmed by the combination of Rosa's incredible performance and the story they had just learned about her sacrifice and hidden identity. The applause went on for several minutes, with some audience members standing and others shouting, "Bravo!" as if they were at Carnegie Hall rather than a conservatory reception. David stood motionless beside the piano, his face a mask of shock and growing shame. The applause that surrounded him felt like thunder in his ears, each clap a reminder of how completely and utterly wrong he had been. The woman he had tried to humiliate had just delivered one of the most moving performances any of them had ever witnessed. While his own technically perfect playing suddenly seemed cold and meaningless by comparison, Rosa slowly lifted her hands from the keys and sat quietly for a moment, seeming surprised by the intensity of the audience's reaction. She had become so lost in the music that she had almost forgotten where she was. As the applause continued, she stood and gave a modest bow, her eyes glistening with tears that spoke of years of suppressed emotion finally being released. Professor Williams pushed through the crowd to reach Rosa, his own eyes filled with tears of joy and amazement. "Rosa Mendez," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I heard you play this same piece with the London Symphony 18 years ago. You were extraordinary then, but tonight you were transcendent." Word of Rosa's true identity had spread throughout the entire reception by now, and people were gathering around her with expressions of awe and respect. Many were pulling up old articles and videos on their phones, sharing stories of Rosa's legendary performances from her teenage years. The quiet woman who had spent months sitting in the back of classrooms was suddenly revealed as one of classical music's great lost talents. David watched this transformation with growing horror and shame. Everything he had said about Rosa, every cruel comment he had made about her appearance and background, now echoed in his mind like accusations. He had not only been wrong about her abilities, he had been cruel to someone whose sacrifice and dedication far exceeded anything he had ever experienced. As the initial excitement began to settle, David knew he had to do something. The weight of his behavior was crushing him, and he could feel the eyes of the audience occasionally turning toward him with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. His reputation as the conservatory's star student meant nothing now. He would be remembered as the arrogant young man who had tried to humiliate a master. With trembling legs, David approached Rosa, who was still surrounded by admirers and well-wishers. The crowd parted to let him through, and an uncomfortable silence fell as everyone realized what was about to happen. Rosa turned to face him, her expression calm and dignified despite everything he had put her through. David began, then stopped, his voice failing him. He tried again, forcing himself to meet Rosa's eyes despite his overwhelming shame. "I owe you the most sincere apology of my life. What I did tonight was cruel and inexcusable. I judged you based on your appearance and background, and I tried to humiliate you to make myself look better. I was completely wrong about everything." Rosa listened to his apology with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the evening. When David finished speaking, she was silent for a moment, seeming to consider her response carefully. Then she spoke in her soft but clear voice. "We all make mistakes when we let our ego control our actions. What matters is what we learn from those mistakes." Her forgiveness was more devastating to David than any anger could have been. It showed a maturity and wisdom that made his own behavior seem even more childish and petty. Several people in the audience nodded approvingly at Rosa's gracious response, while others looked at David with expressions that suggested his reputation would take a very long time to recover. Over the following days and weeks, the story of what happened that night spread throughout the classical music world. Videos of Rosa's performance were shared thousands of times on social media, and major orchestras began reaching out to her about returning to the concert stage. After 17 years of silence, Rosa Mendez was being welcomed back to the world she had been forced to leave behind. David's response to the incident surprised many people. Instead of trying to make excuses or minimize what had happened, he threw himself into a period of deep self-reflection. He used his connections in the music world not to promote himself, but to help Rosa get the opportunities she deserved. He arranged meetings with conductors and booking agents, and he publicly acknowledged her superior talent whenever anyone would listen. The experience had fundamentally changed David's understanding of what it meant to be a musician. He began studying not just the technical aspects of music, but its emotional and spiritual dimensions. His playing gradually became warmer and more expressive as he learned to serve the music, rather than use it to serve his ego. Rosa eventually returned to performing, though she chose her engagements carefully, balancing her musical career with her continued devotion to her family. Her comeback performances were met with standing ovations and critical acclaim, with many reviewers noting that her years of struggle had given her playing a depth and authenticity that few artists ever achieved. The conservatory offered Rosa a full scholarship and eventually a teaching position, which she accepted. Her classes became some of the most popular at the school, not just because of her incredible talent, but because of her wisdom about the true purpose of music and the importance of humility and artistry. David completed his studies at the conservatory and went on to have a successful career as both a performer and teacher. However, he never forgot the lesson Rosa had taught him that night. He became known not just for his technical skill, but for his kindness to other musicians and his dedication to serving the music rather than using it to feed his ego. Years later, David and Rosa would occasionally perform together at special events, their partnership serving as a reminder that music has the power not just to entertain, but to transform hearts and teach the most important lessons about humility, respect, and the true meaning of greatness.